Alright, welcome to today's Explainer. Today, we are setting the stage for a massive deep dive into one of the most chilling, psychologically complex antagonists in the history of storytelling. We are unpacking Naoki Urasawa's absolute masterpiece, Monster, and we're going to tear down the terrifying architecture of its central villain, Johan Liebert.
So, let's just jump right into this by challenging an idea. When you hear the word monster, what actually pops into your head? Are you picturing a creature with fangs? Or maybe a villain with, world-ending superpowers? Well, as we're going to see today, the sources we're analyzing make a pretty compelling argument that a true monster isn't born from magic or supernatural abilities. The absolute most terrifying monsters? They are entirely human. They're forged in the fires of extreme psychological devastation.
Okay, Section 1. Beyond typical anime villains.
To really understand Johan, we kind of have to establish a baseline, right? We need to contrast him with the masterminds we already know. Think about an iconic villain like Light Yagami from Death Note. Light is driven by this heavily twisted sense of justice. His ultimate goal is to exert complete control, to judge humanity, and to literally rule as the god of a new world. He creates chaos specifically to gain power. But Johan Liebert? He is the exact opposite. His entire method relies on weaponizing human trauma. He doesn't want to rule the world at all. He wants to reduce it to total nothingness, and he wants to start with himself. His brand of chaos isn't born from a desire to control society, but to prove that society, morality, and life itself are just completely meaningless.
I mean, just listen to the chilling words of business tycoon Hans-Jörg Schuwald, who is one of the many people caught in Johan's web. Schuwald doesn't talk about Johan's physical strength or some crazy weapon. He talks about his presence. Johan is a character who commands absolute, terrifying power without ever having to throw a single punch.
Moving on to Section 2, Methods of Psychological Warfare.
So how does a guy without superpowers or a massive army cause such widespread, catastrophic destruction? Well, his entire arsenal is built on the manipulation and exploitation of the human psyche. His signature method is this terrifying concept called weaponized nihilism. He doesn't physically force his victims to do his bidding. Instead, he alters the very fulcrum of a person's identity. He acts like a mirror, reflecting their deepest, darkest traumas right back at them, withdrawing his support at the exact moment it will cause the maximum amount of damage and basically nudging them to voluntarily destroy themselves.
He literally acts as a catalyst for people's hidden demons. Take Detective Richard Braun, for example. Johan masterfully manipulated Braun's guilt over his past alcoholism, convincing him he was fundamentally unworthy of ever seeing his daughter again, which ultimately drove him to suicide. Or Milos, this cheerful orphaned boy. Johan systematically convinced him that he was entirely unwanted by his mother, pushing the kid right to the brink of despair. And honestly, the most horrifying example is at the Kinderheim 511 orphanage. Johan didn't kill anyone directly there. He simply planted seeds of doubt, slowly turned up the tension, and sat back while the staff and children massacred each other.
And to understand just how unique this is, we can compare Johan to his own loyal henchman, Roberto. Roberto represents what the sources call organic evil. He's violent, he's sadistic, and he's driven by basic self-preservation. He worships Johan because it gives his own cruelty a sense of meaning. Johan, on the other hand, represents self-actualized evil. Johan actually has virtually no sadistic urges. He doesn't take joy in violence at all. He views human beings completely dispassionately, treating them as pawns in this grand philosophical experiment to prove the absolute fragility of the human conscience.
Which brings us to Section 3, a psychoanalytic profile.
Let's see how this all builds into a clinical understanding of his fractured mind. We can actually use real psychological frameworks to decode him. Using a psychoanalytic lens, we can map Johan's mind using Sigmund Freud's tripartite psyche. Johan is heavily dominated by his id. This is what drives his base, primal impulse for destruction and self-annihilation. But it's his ego that makes him so incredibly dangerous because it functions perfectly to strategically regulate those destructive impulses. It allows him to be patient, charming, and calculated. His superego, which is essentially the moral compass, is almost completely absent. It really only shows up in his intensely twisted protective attachment to his twin sister, Nina.
And if we run Johan through the DSM-5 checklist for psychopathy, he checks almost every single box. Deceitfulness? Yes, absolutely. Reckless disregard for safety? For sure. A complete lack of remorse? Without a doubt. But there is one absolutely crucial trait he lacks: impulsivity. Johan does not act on a whim. He is highly strategic,
operating with what psychologists might classify as an INTJA or architect personality type. What makes this so fascinating and honestly terrifying is just how rare it is for primary psychopaths to possess such long-term, calculated traits without eventually making impulsive slip-ups. It is exactly this lack of impulsivity that elevates him from a common criminal to basically an unstoppable force of nature.
All right, Section 4, the trauma of the nameless.
Monsters aren't just born in a vacuum, right? They are made. So let's look at the crucible of extreme trauma that forged Johan. Tracing his timeline, we see he never really had a chance at a normal life. Before he was even born, he was the product of a government eugenics experiment designed to create exceptional children. Then came the defining trauma at age 5 or 6, the moment at the Red Rose Mansion where his mother was forced to give up one of her twins for a horrific experiment. She hesitated, looking between Johan and his sister, and ultimately chose to send his sister away. That split second of hesitation completely fractured Johan's sense of identity and attachment forever. And this was followed by isolated abandonment at a place called the Three Frogs, and later the brutal psychological conditioning of Kinderheim 511.
And all of this leads to a massive, mind-shattering breaking point. Years later, as a young adult, Johan is in the Munich library. He opens a children's picture book called The Nameless Monster, and while reading it, he suffers a complete collapse and faints. Why? Because the book triggers a devastating realization. Johan had internalized his twin sister's horrific memories at the Red Rose Mansion as his own. His entire identity, his core belief that he was the primary victim of the world's cruelty, is completely shattered in an instant. He realizes he conflated her trauma with his own existence.
Section 5, seeking the perfect suicide.
This realization in the library shifts his ultimate endgame. It evolves from this vague desire for the end of the world into a deeply intimate, deeply disturbing goal. Johan devises a plan for what the sources call the perfect suicide. Now, it's not just about ending his life, it's about erasing the fact that he ever existed in the first place. Step 1 is to systematically eliminate everyone who ever knew him, his foster parents, acquaintances, literally anyone who remembers his face. Step 2 is to burn down the physical locations of his past. But step 3 is the most twisted part of the whole thing. He intends to force Dr. Kenzo Tenma, the brilliant, purely compassionate surgeon who actually saved Johan's life when he was a child, to be the one to pull the trigger.
I mean, listen to this philosophy. He says, Dr. Tenma, for you, all lives are created equal. That's why I came back to life. But you finally come to realize it now, haven't you? Only one thing is equal for all, and that is death. He doesn't just want to die. He wants to break Dr. Tenma. Tenma represents the ultimate existential good, the belief that life has inherent value. Johan wants to force Tenma to take a life, thereby proving his own twisted, nihilistic worldview correct, that human morality is just a fragile illusion, and in the end, the only true equalizer is death.
And finally, Section 6, the balance of morality. This brings us to the philosophical clash that anchors this entire explainer and really the core of the story itself. Here we have the ultimate yin and yang. On one side, Dr. Tenma, he represents existential good. He knows the world is corrupt and unfair, but he actively chooses to do good, to heal people, and to value every single human life equally. On the exact opposite side is Johan Liebert. He represents nihilistic evil. Johan believes life is nothing but a meaningless, insignificant flash in an empty universe. Tenma builds and preserves, Johan deconstructs and annihilates. And this matters so deeply to us as viewers because it practically forces us to ask whether our own moral compass is built on a solid foundation or if it could be easily shattered by trauma.
But here is the craziest part of the whole thing. The tragic paradox that binds these two together. Johan's terrifying, world-ending evil was allowed to flourish only because Dr. Tenma acted out of pure, selfless compassion. Years ago, Tenma defied his hospital's direct orders to operate on a powerful, corrupt politician and instead chose to save a dying little boy. That boy was Johan. An act of pure, untainted goodness directly birthed an era of pure evil.
And that leaves us with a haunting question to close out today's explainer. What if Dr. Tenma had made the selfish, politically motivated choice? What if he had let the little boy die and saved the mayor instead? That single, quote-unquote, corrupt act would have destroyed the Nameless Monster before he ever had the chance to spread his suffering across the world. So does pure goodness always yield good results? Or is a little bit of darkness sometimes necessary to keep the ultimate evil at bay? Let that sink in. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive, and keep questioning the balance of the world around you.